Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's talk with Bruce Marwick, Architectural Tile and Terracotta from a 3,000-mile road trip. Most of you have, I hope, seen Bruce before. He is with the Sacramento Art Deco Society that is joining us this evening, and people from Eventbrite, so thank you very much. He is the go-to person for me that is anything that is about architecture or really art in Sacramento. He'll talk more about himself. This is being recorded and everyone will receive a link. Again, just a reminder that if you could hold off on using the chat for now and hold down your questions or write them, put them in the chat letter. We'll also allow you to put your hands up and you'll be able to ask questions. And if you've taken some of this road trip, share some of your own stories. Throwing it to you, Bruce.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. And first, I always want to thank the Renaissance Society for giving me the opportunity to present and give exposure to some of the architecture and art, not only of the Sacramento region, but other areas of the country that I've been in and been interested in telling these unique tales. Tonight, I'm going to talk about tile and terracotta. And before I get started into it, I want to give you a little bit of background. I was a commercial artist. I've always been interested in the arts. And about 20 years ago, I was actually had the opportunity, as many of you may have, to visit the Gladding McBean factory in Lincoln. And it was kind of a spellbinding moment because I realized here within 20, 30 miles of Sacramento was a old world art factory, a factory that brought over artisans, predominantly from Italy, to create, just fabulous bas reliefs and sculptures tied to buildings. And I subsequently, another name you might have heard of, Gary Kuritz, who was for many years the special collections librarian at the California State Library. Matter of fact, I always like to give Gary a plug. This is his book that came out about 25, 30 years ago on Gladding McBean. It's a fabulous book if you're interested in the subject. And that kind of what kicked off my interest to, do more research on the industry, architectural terracotta, tile in general. So that gives you a little bit of historic background. And then 10 years ago, right after the great recession, I had an opportunity, a car became available in Pennsylvania that I could drive back cross country. And I thought, boy, this is the moment where I want to do Route 66. And then I gave it some additional thought and I thought, boy, I can also do the National Road, which was the kind of the, dare I say, the 19th century version of Route 66. And in addition, it would get me through the Ohio Valley, which as some of you might know, is where really the pottery industry of America came to age, and in particular also industrial and architectural terracotta. So as I mentioned, 10 years ago, I flew to the East Coast. The car was actually my dad's car. He passed away in 1999 and my mother kept the car. It was a very cute car. So I actually looked forward to the opportunity. So, but before I get that far, I'm going to talk about this 3,000-mile road trip. And the trip was from initially Pennsylvania across those eastern states, Pennsylvania, of course, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And the first town I was really focused on, my sister actually lives in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was Wheeling, West Virginia. But before I talk about that, I also want to talk about the other part of the trip, which was, in my case, St. Louis to California, which was Route 66. And, you know, it just kind of hit me that it was such a wonderful duality of starting with the National Road and finishing up with Route 66. So here's the car I picked up. This was or is, because I actually still own the car. It's a 1996 Volkswagen Cabrio. And I just thought it was in terrific condition. When I picked it up in 2010, it only had 30,000 miles. And it was just a great opportunity. The picture I'm showing you, my sister, as I mentioned, lives in central Pennsylvania, I gave her the idea, well, boy, I think that, this trip might turn into a lecture or two. I need a good kickoff spot here in the community of Carlisle. Do you have anything in mind? And we talked about it for a few minutes. She says, boy, down the road, there is a farmer who's got this little enclave of a gas station, some railroad cars, and given the kind of history of Route 66, that might be an attractive way. So we drove down there and I said, sure enough, that's a great backdrop. So this was the start in early April 2010. I want to initially talk, because I do kind of get into the weeds on what terracotta is in comparison to what pottery and tile is. So I'm going to just go through a couple slides, kind of just defining what terracotta is all about. One of the important things is terracotta are objects that are not made on a potter's wheel. It's made from high-grade clay that has been enriched with sand and pulverized. And this is important because most terracotta is actually being pressed into molds. So that's why it needs to be a very fine grade, so that in highly detailed sculptures, you want the sand and clay to get into every nook and cranny of those molds. The clay is easily molded by hand, just like I mentioned. You want to be able to press it in to the molds. Once completed, it is air dried prior to having a glaze applied. And finally, it's typically fired in large furnaces such as Beehive Kilns. If you've ever seen a picture of the early days of Gladding McBean out in Lincoln, they had very flat, squatty kilns. On the East Coast, they seem to favor more what they called beehive. They were tall, slender, but they both kind of did the same thing. I think Gladding McBean might have liked squattier because they could put larger objects in them. In this particular case, this is actually a beehive in Cincinnati, Ohio, that I will talk about, and I did visit on the road trip. And then what made terracotta valuable as a building material? It was an inexpensive to manufacture in comparison to stone. It was fire resistant, which was particularly important after the many fires of the 19th century, including the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and more familiar to Californians, the 1906 in San Francisco. This was really important to designers and architects. It could be glazed to simulate any kind of stone. And most importantly, different from hanging, actual stone to a building like limestone, you could create it and manufacture it in such a way that it was coffered on the back side, so that it had you'd all twofold. You would eliminate weight and you would eliminate material, which was beneficial in cost and production. And I always like to share, and I'll share right now, and I'll talk about this piece. This is actually a piece of architectural terracotta from my own personal collection. It's like a 12 by 12 foot square, but in the back you can see it's a kind of a diminutive piece, but it has two coffers, and it just helps eliminate weight. And also in the firing, it allowed for more even firing. And most importantly, many of the large buildings, you would need to make 100 or 200 or 1,000 of the same piece of architectural terracotta, so it was very easy to replicate. And I also always wondered, where did the words terracotta come from? They're Latin meaning burnt or cooked earth. And that just seems very appropriate, particularly when I share some of the examples of buildings I saw on the trip. Now, as I mentioned, Wheeling, West Virginia earlier, and I don't know if any of you are familiar, Wheeling is in the northwest corner of West Virginia. It's actually very close to the border of both Ohio and Pennsylvania. And its importance is geographic. Just like Sacramento, being on the confluence of two rivers, Wheeling was on the Ohio River. And many Eastern business people thought, boy, if Wheeling could ever be opened up and create a access between the Atlantic seaboard and Wheeling, then the whole Ohio River region and the Midwest would open up for trade. So Wheeling was an ideal space and spot to develop clay and clay factories. The most famous of which is the Wheeling Pottery Company. And I love this is just a letterhead of theirs, but I love it because you can see all of their beehive kilns running down one side of the factory. And this is just, kind of a classic image of 19th century Industrial Revolution. So when I was researching the trip across country, I spent quite a bit of time online, and I looked for opportunities to, try to pre-plan what buildings did I want to see. Are there any real standouts that I would absolutely not want to miss? And in particular, one jumped out at me in Wheeling was the Schmulbach Brewing Company. And it jumped out at me because being a Sacramentan, I was familiar with two of the great brewery institutions of Sacramento, Roostaller and Buffalo Brewing, and I knew their buildings didn't exist anymore. So I was very excited when I saw this building online. And here we see, the cornice of Schmulbach. And here's some details of the heads, and the heads are terrific. One of the things that I will point out here is terracotta generally had a glazed. Obviously, this terracotta had a brick glaze to match the building so that the bas reliefs would match the brick. And of course, through the years, it's worn away. And to me, this only adds to kind of the mystique of the figures. Here's another head. And then this is a part or the main building. It has survived to today. At this point, it has been abandoned. Although if you look to the lower left-hand corner, there are additional buildings that are still being used by new brew companies to this day. And so I mentioned Roostaller and Buffalo, and if you're not familiar with their buildings from Sacramento, these buildings, just like I shared with you, Schmulbach from Wheeling, this is what they looked like. And this can kind of give you an idea of why I was excited to see it. As you might know, the Buffalo Brewing factory was torn down for the B building at 21st and Q, and the Roostaller was at 12th and H. Now, another building I saw that I absolutely had to see in Wheeling was a theater, and it was the Capitol Theater. And this is looking at their heroic figurative sculptures on the top of the building. And what I like about this photo is that it actually, you can see how the sculptures were actually created as pieces, almost like a puzzle, and put back together. Unfortunately, when the building was either being preserved or just stabilized, they didn't take care to get a complementary color grout or whatever material they use, so it really sticks out. But it does kind of lend, although I think inside the monogram, that looks just like cracking. I don't think that was the original design for the pieces, but it's certainly with the characters, you can see their respective, how they were cast and reassembled. And then here's the full building. And this theater was actually built in the mid to late 1920s. And as I've mentioned about Sacramento buildings, many times cities that were more regional cities, even though the Art Deco era had started, they were still putting up, very classically traditional building and the Beaux-Arts style, Greek Revival style, and of course, down below we have a a cornice that actually has a more stylish Hollywood style covering. The Wheeling Historical Society were gracious enough to send me some pictures of the building. Here's a picture of the interior around the time it opened with these wonderful faux treatments. And then they also sent me this article about an Italian sculptor who had worked on figures for the theater. And I thought, wow, that really makes me think of Gladding McBean. So after I visited Wheeling, my next city in my sights was Zanesville. It's not too far away. It's only about 75 miles west. And I spent 2 days in Zanesville, and I wanted to spend 2 days because Zanesville, in terms of the Ohio Valley, was really the home and the largest producing city of tile, pottery, and architectural terracotta in the region. In many ways, Zanesville was the birthplace of American tile. In the 1870s, most tile was imported from England, and architectural terracotta really wasn't made here. Buildings of the period were clad in brick, marble, limestone, and granite. And then in 1974, Freudian slip, 1874, two entrepreneurs, Frederick Hall and Benedict Fisher, founded a tile company in Zanesville to compete with European imports. And in 1878, Hall and Fisher becomes American Encaustic Tile Company. Their acronym was AETCO. And you'll see that as we go through this presentation. So on the left is a catalog from American Encaustic, and then on the right is a bas relief of their great competitor, the Mosaic Tile Company. And both were huge institutions, employed thousands of workers. American Encaustic became so large, they actually bought some West Coast companies, and they were not the only players, but they were the biggest players in Zanesville. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was over 20 manufacturers in Zanesville alone. And then there were many other manufacturers sprinkled from Wheeling in the east, 200 miles to the west, all the way to Cincinnati. Now, kind of one of the featured buildings for tile is the Muskegon County Courthouse. Now, the courthouse actually is stone on the outside, but it became notable because it had one of the first solely American accessed or resourced tile from American Encaustic. And what you're looking at is the interior foyer of the building. And it had several thousand square feet of what is called encaustic tile. And American Encaustic bid on it. They bid against English producers and they won. And this became a kind of a featured example of their early work. Here's a close-up. The importance of encaustic tile was its durability. These tiles are almost a ½ inch thick, and the top, roughly 3/16 of an inch, was solid clay powder. So if you chipped it, more than likely there was additional color underneath. And so it's very, very durable. Here's kind of a nice corner detail. And then I'm going to talk about a few of the other buildings I discovered in Zanesville. This was the Clausman hardware store. It struck me for two reasons. The first was I love this tile entrance, mosaic tile entrance, because the year is the same year as the 1876 as the county courthouse. And it's also about the time that the industry really got started in Zanesville. I also like that the building had this nice lower frieze of tile along the retail windows. And I also thought, being that this was originally created for the Art Deco Society, I thought this was actually an antique mall, that there's a very attractive window and very period appropriate. Another wonderful thing is in Zanesville, for the interested tile person, is just to drive around and see what remains of the old factories. Many of the buildings are still up. Many of them still have their ghost signage. Here's obviously a loading dock with the upper floors, wonderful display of encaustic tiling company. And then this was my favorite. I actually knew I was going to look for the Mosaic Tile Company factory complex, but for whatever reason, I had not pre-seen this wonderful building where they had spelled out the company's name with bricks. And it just really caught my fancy. It was a wonderful discovery. And I was blessed because that particular day the factory had been started to be reused, kind of like our Campbell's factory on Freeport Boulevard in Sacramento. The different warehouses had now been started to be used by other companies. But this particular section of the plant was pretty much untouched. And when I actually was able to kind of pull up to this building through a chain link fence, and I got out of the car and I looked down and I said, "Is that tile?" And I started looking around. There was grass and gravel, but everywhere there were broken shards of tile. And this really just caught my fancy because I had known that the plant had closed in the late 60s. So in 2010, this tile had been laying out there for 40, 50, 60 years untouched. And I made kind of a snap judgment, and I got like a Ziploc bag from my car, and I kind of went through and just picked out some pieces of this broken shards because I thought it was just so intriguing. Kind of maybe an analogy would be a Glass Beach in Fort Bragg. Another discovery I made, and the reason I wanted to share that hardware store, was that upstairs I had not found. I was really hoping to find some tiled examples in Zanesville. I was not successful, but while I was talking to someone, they said, "Well, I do have some loose tiles upstairs, not open to the public," but he told me where to go. And I found some tiles. They were actually 6x6s. What caught my attention was not the face, but the backside. The backside had this wonderful impression of the corporate logo of the Mosaic Tile Company. And I actually bought a couple just for the backside. Another great institution in Zanesville is the Zanesville Museum of Art. They have fabulous collections of pottery. In particular, I'll start with showing you here in the lower left-hand corner this wonderful Weller pot. which is huge. This is me standing beside it. I was just thought, wow, I mean, just the thought of moving that pot alone. But that was just the beginning, because inside they just had so much pottery from the area, all styles, whether it be arts and crafts and deco and streamline, just, you know, kind of overwhelming in many ways. And then the cities of Zanesville, as many cities have across America, to create kind of a promotional energy, had created these fiberglass pots and had the community painted them, and they spotted around town. But boy, that seemed very appropriate. So I photographed 3 of their fiberglass pots. In the background is Zanesville has a famous bridge. It's actually Y-shaped bridge. It actually has 3 legs and meets in the middle over the middle of the river. Now I'm going to move on to Cincinnati. Another notable name of the Ohio Valley pottery industry was Rookwood. Their symbol was the raven. And this is actually from their factory building at entrance gates. And the building still exists to this day. This is a postcard from the factory in the teens. And this is what it looks like today. And I was really pleased. On the left, right here is where those ravens, or that raven gate, was. And then earlier I told you, or showed you when I was making it, providing definitions of terracotta, this is actually a beehive kiln poking through the roof of the old factory. And this particular side is a restaurant, and you can actually have a private dinner in certain beehive kilns. Another terrific building is the Carew Tower in downtown Cincinnati. And it very much got my attention because it is a Art Deco skyscraper. And in addition to being a wonderful example of the era, to the right is a hotel that also still has much of its Art Deco decorative features. But since we're discussing tile, I want to show you the main entrance hall of the Carew Tower. And this is it. It's 2 stories high. It runs the length of the block because the tower sits on a full city block. And in this particular area, they had shops on 2 levels. But what I want to bring your attention to is the surround as the hall transitions to a 1-story departure area. This entire surround is Rookwood pottery, or I should say bas relief. Here's a detail very much in the Art Deco style. And then a detail at the bottom showing the Rookwood logo. That was their longtime logo with the R reversed to the P for Rookwood pottery. And one of the wonderful things about, if you know anything about vintage Rookwood pottery, they always dated their pieces. So if you look under the RP, you can see the date. And I have to forgive, it's not quite as sharp, but I think it was for 1930 or right in that vicinity. So it's one of the great things, whether you own a piece of pottery or you have a building with architectural terracotta by Rookwood, you know the date. Another terrific building in Cincinnati is the old Union Terminal Railroad Station, probably one of the finest pieces of commercial public Art Deco architecture in America. You can see the entrance fountains that proceed up to the main building. This is also a great example of how terracotta can be made to look like stone. And of course, as is common in much Art Deco, a lot of the bas-reliefs, relate to Mercury and speed. Inside the terminal, I digress a moment, the terminal building no longer serves as a railroad station, but Cincinnati has done a terrific job. It's a multi-museum complex at this point, and it's just a wonderful facility. Kind of reminds me of Washington, D.C.'s kind of adaptive reuse of their grand terminal. But within the terminal, they have this wonderfully preserved 100% rookwood tile tea room. Very, very much in colors that were popular during the 30s. Once again, with a great identifier tile. And then I found another building that I loved in Cincinnati, but it brought up a question because when I first saw it, I realized, gosh, I'm going to have to do some little background research. I'm not so sure that it's terracotta. Maybe it's limestone. The building is the Time Star building. And it is the building put up in the 20s by the newspaper Time Star of Cincinnati. And it is a great Art Deco building. Here's a detail. As I mentioned, when I first saw the building, I thought, boy, that's got to be terracotta. There's no absolute way they would have carved it. Well, of all things, most of the building is truly carved limestone. That said, it is a terrific piece of Art Deco. One of its more just beautiful little details is this entrance, the newsboy entrance. Close up. So I finally made it to St. Louis, Missouri, after a wonderful 5 or 6 days on the National Road. And historically, 66 ran from Chicago to Santa Monica Pier in California. For this trip, I elected, because I had done that segment prior, Chicago to St. Louis, just to do when I hit St. Louis, head west. But I did take the opportunity of spending a couple of days in St. Louis, and you can see the Volkswagen parked on Cherokee Street, which is a wonderful antique row in St. Louis. And then there are just other great buildings. This one kind of Tudor with some terrific subway tile treatment. Right on a corner in a very narrow pie-shaped piece of land. Another discovery I made was kind of a derelict factory building, but I looked up and I said, boy, that's an interesting piece of terracotta tile. I stopped and I said, this had to be either a toy factory or a candy factory. It turned out it had previously been a candy factory. One of the things I came to appreciate about Route 66 is that there are many different alignments that actually going through a city like St. Louis, there's actually 6 different routes you can take. For example, you could take like the 1930 route and the 1935 route. They kept changing. But on one of the main routes, I saw this store, and it gave me a chuckle because it had wonderful Art Deco tile details, but I thought it was kind of amusing how the store was currently used. Here's a little close-up detail. Also on Cherokee Street, I found this wonderful little grocery store. I have no idea what the store was originally intended for, probably retail, but just very, very nice terracotta, given the modest size of the building. And then I would be remiss not to talk a little bit about Route 66, because one of the other draws for me was to also kind of delve in to the gas, Petrolana, kind of that Grapes of Wrath history of Route 66. And much to my surprise, there all along the route are people who have kind of taken upon themselves to be unofficial, official ambassadors of Route 66. There are people who've restored gas stations. There are people who are just into the vintage signage. These are two different locations where I had the proprietors take pictures of me and their wonderful establishments. In the center is a little Phillips 66 gas station in a little town created off the beaten path. A gentleman has gathered like 20 buildings and created a little town, including a little church. And it's just was a wonderful piece of discovery. I never knew where I was going to end up and what little discoveries I was going to make along the way. So alignments, talking about Route 66. The other reality is that there are some portions of Route 66 that have truly survived, meaning you can go down 5, 10, 20 miles on Route 66 undisturbed. This is an example of it. It's in Missouri. The interstate has bypassed it. And you can see there's the Volkswagen and not a car in sight. This road eventually would wind down into what's called Devil's Elbow. So I apologize or forget the name of the river, but I took the opportunity once again because it's just a great vintage bridge to get out of the car and take a picture. And then no trip along Route 66 would be fulfilled unless you saw all of the oddities, whether it be dinosaurs or giant things. In this case, somebody decided to create the world's largest rocker. So as I mentioned, I got on Route 66 in St. Louis. I went across through Missouri, stopped in Joplin, then went on to Oklahoma and stopped in Tulsa. Once again, found Tulsa is a really interesting city in that it was a very wealthy city in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And it was because of fossil fuels. It was because of oil. So I had heard, and it turned out to be the case, that Tulsa has some of the finest Art Deco architecture in the country. I believe this is the tower of the, it was actually a produce or farmer's market building. This is the United Methodist Church, which, as I mentioned, is just a terrific piece of architecture. The figures that you're looking at are heroic. They're probably 8 to 10 feet high to give you a good idea of the scale of this building. In the detail, once again, you can get a good feel for the decorative terracotta, basically almost like pieces, how they went together. And then some of the other nice discoveries were more contemporary. Certainly a lot of the little towns, in this case, Amarillo, have, saw the marketing opportunities. And in this particular case, a business had put together a really wonderful terracotta wall, in this case, really tile. And before I talk about Albuquerque, one other thing that I'd be remiss not to share is that one of the other great discoveries when I was out on the route, and I was out for 3 weeks, was finding, I went intentionally in mid-April because I thought I would miss most tourism or heavy duty traffic. And that came to be the case, but I made some wonderful meetings of international individuals and couples traversing Route 666 as I was. And what kind of amazed me were how fascinated Europeans were by Route 66 and how many had really seen it as a piece of their bucket list to make the discovery of the West. One of the other great ironies I found speaking to Europeans was they didn't really make a lot of distinction between the Old West of the 1870s and the 1880s and the more recent Depression era West of the 1930s. It kind of all ran together for them, but they still thought it was exciting. Now, probably most important terracotta building in Albuquerque is the Chemo Theater. And it is an interesting building in that it has a kind of a multitude of styles. It's almost kind of characterized as either Deco Pueblo, is it one of the descriptions? It has certainly arts and crafts. So it's a real mix of styles, but once again, the tile is terrific. This is the entrance area. Of course, the ticket booth. I like to shoot photographs of buildings as much as I can. And one of the best ways to help identify buildings is to see if they still have their dedication plates. And many times it will include the architect, the contractor, who financed it, was it WPA, Work Project Administration, and then the date it was erected. So they are wonderful pieces. And in this particular case, they did a wonderful job doing the kind of the zigzag to match the building's style and detail. Here's another building I've discovered in Albuquerque, and they had done a wonderful job adding a second story dining area. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful way to kind of acknowledge the detailing. At night, it was lit up. It was just very nice. And the style actually reminds me very much of the fire station building, or I should have fire station, the Firestone building in Sacramento at 16th and K. Indoor detail at the same restaurant. Now I'm going to move on to Los Angeles. And one of the wonderful things about LA, and I lived in LA for many years, is it had very eccentric architecture in the 20s and 30s. I don't know if I imagine some of it was influenced by Hollywood, but very much in the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of over-the-top architectural detailing to buildings. And one of my favorites is in a little town, Monrovia, on Route 66, coming into the LA basin, and it's the Aztec Hotel. And it's just a wonderful over-the-top building. This gives you a grander perspective of the building. And the hotel was, of course, to the rear with small retail shops in front. And this is the interior. And then coming into Los Angeles proper, Los Angeles has some just a terrific Art Deco buildings that have survived from the 30s all the way to the present. And in particular, there are 3 or 4 that are notables, including the Eastern Department Store building, which now is actually luxury condos. But the building also has that wonderful blue aqua tile that we associate with the Deco era. And I'll also mention, if my memory serves me correct, the tile is all by Gladding McBean. Probably by Gladding McBean, what became so large as they were successful throughout the Great Depression, that they actually bought several companies in Southern California. Here's a detail. This is the entrance. So the entrance doors would be right below these kind of glorious sunburst, which is another popular feature of the Deco, and also these strong vertical piers, also very Deco. So one of the things I like to talk about terracotta is that terracotta is kind of like porcelain of our teeth. If you don't take care of it and moisture gets underneath the porcelain, it's disaster. Luckily, as downtown Los Angeles has had a resurgence in the last 20, 25 years, buildings that have been long neglected have become valuable properties to restore, and the Eastern is one of those. And so this photo just absolutely shows the condition that the upper stories was in, and that the developers came and lovingly restored and properly sealed the building. So you can see the Eastern is roughly 11 stories to the tower, and then of course the tower goes another 6, 7 stories. So that kind of ends the lion's share of many of the buildings I discovered. I tried to be very prudent and just give you a good overview of the different types of buildings I discovered, and kind of the diversity of tile and terracotta, what is out there. But I also like to just talk briefly about American caustic and Gladding McBean and their importance. So I just thought I'd, just help kind of reflect on, since I was mostly talking about terracotta, is talking about tiles and their importance. And they're a tremendous about a variety. So these are 3 or 4 examples of encaustic tiles, or American encaustic tiles. In this particular case, that's the name of the company and not specifically the kind of tiles. So I'm going to talk about a couple little styles. One is intaglio, which means it's really the reverse of bas relief, where bas relief, the image comes out, intaglio, the image goes in. And it classically would have this high contrast between the surfaces, with the background generally being quite dark. Of course, we talked about encaustic tiles that have this 3/16 to 1/4 inch clay powder that's baked. So it's very durable, can last 100 years in a commercial or public sector building. And then many tiles we associate with California. Some of you might be familiar with the California arts and crafts movement. Many of those tiles were in what they called faience. They had I would call more of a rustic look. They were done generally, the grounds, the color glaces were put on a more rustic bisque. And so they were very popular. Anytime you see any of the Santa Barbara buildings type of treatments, those are generally faience style. Another style was raised line tiles. That's where basically the tiles had raised lines, and so the color was floated inside the lines. Another thing that I started to explore after this trip was, if I would find a single tile and realize it was part of a pattern, what would they look like assembled? So here's are just three examples that, when you see it as a single tile, it has a totally different look and feel when you put them all together. Now I see the pattern. And finally, dry line tiles are similar to the raised line. It's just a different way in which to control the color. And here are examples by another famous tile maker, of course, this time on the West Coast, Catalina Pottery. And it was one of those tile manufacturers that was bought up by Gladding McBean in 1937. Some of you may be asking, well, how was Gladding McBean successful through the 1930s? And it was because of sewer pipe, actually. Sewer pipe, even to this day, is still considered the highest quality sewer pipe that a city can put in. It is expensive in comparison to synthetics. And to this day, Gladding McBean still produces a terracotta commercial city utility piping. So my last tile example, and it's right here in Sacramento, some of you may recognize it, is the Eureka tile murals that are in the California State Capitol. There's actually 4 of them at 4 corners of the building. And there's a connection to Zanesville, Ohio. The original tiles showing Minerva with the California bear were produced in 1896 by, in this case, Mosaic Tile, the great competitor of American Encaustic. And if you're familiar with the tile, familiar with the Capitol, there is one example of this original Eureka mural downstairs in the cafeteria area in what's called the Eureka Room. So I thought that it was a fitting tie-in with Zanesville and National Road to give a shout out to Eureka at the state capitol. So that's the end. And before I shut off, I'd also like to give a shout out to the Sacramento Art Deco Society. I am the preservation chair of the society, and we have a Facebook page, we have a website. If you're so moved and enjoyed this presentation, we would love to have you donate if you're so interested, and you can do that at our website. So with that, I will end the presentation.
Bruce, thank you so much. Oh, we'll have you stop the share.
Okay.
So thank you so much. There are some questions in the chat. I'm going to ask you right off first, though, because was there any guide? Did you just do incredible research ahead of time to know where these buildings were, or was some of it happenstance? You just fell into it. You went to a
No,
city.
I did a fair amount of research. And also we have if we have any Art Deco attendees in the Art Deco Society, we have a member by the name of Randy Juster, who, of all things, Randy grew up in New York City, was educated in Chicago in photography, and eventually moved to the West Coast. And then about 10 years ago, or maybe 15, relocated to Sacramento from the Bay Area. And he is a terrific Art Deco photographer. He has photographed buildings all over the planet. So I knew of some of his efforts. I certainly perused his website. And then also, in many cases, some of these cities have Art Deco societies, as Cincinnati does. And in some cases, in the case of Wheeling, if you're ever doing an exploration like this, reach out to the local historical society or trust. Sometimes they have architectural trusts. They are more than willing and interested to help.
Wonderful, great. And so there's some questions in the chat, so I'll read those out, and then I have quite a few questions myself. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, just raise your hands in the reactions. And then I'll make sure that I open up your screen so we can see it. So Catherine asked, did the rocker really rock?
No, the rocker didn't rock, but you know, it's so funny out there. You know, the dinosaurs, and I can't remember the specific, but like there's a giant dinosaur. I think it goes back to the 50s. It has like a slide. You go through the design, and I think you come out the tail, or you know, there's just lots of over the top, and some of these attractions actually date all the way back to the 30s. It's almost like there was. We don't use the word kitsch as much, but I would just call it kitsch. You know, it's wonderful roadside attractions. And I think it really went crazy in the 50s when families started hitting the road in the family sedan.
Good. And then we have another question that it looks like Susan actually answered it, but I will ask it of you. What year was the Methodist church built? Was it really Methodists who built it? Normally Methodists aren't that detailed in their buildings. Susan says 1927 to 29. Did you want to answer the rest of the questions? Was
well, I would say that my guess, and this would be a guess, and that's a terrific research question, is Tulsa wanted to flex its muscles. And I have a feeling that the city fathers, because they were so flush in cash, I mean, there's actually several Frank Lloyd Wright houses in Tulsa. I think that they just wanted to flex their muscles. And that would be my guess, that almost like the Dominicis, I think that they wanted to show that their city had come of age.
And we have a question from Kathy. Where were the goddesses' tiles used?
The goddess tiles associated with
She doesn't specify. This was Kathy Kears. I don't know if she wants to ask that question later so that we're
well, you know, one of
it
the
was
things,
just the tiles that you showed of the women who were semi-dressed.
oh, well, those were considered appropriate tiles for residential. Most of those types of tiles were in residential fireplaces. Sometimes they were used in dining rooms. They were strictly decorative. And dare I say, by today's standards, you know, that's one of the things looking at, because I've been interested in Art Deco for 50 years. And, you know, the whole approach to the maiden and what the maiden represents, and our new relationship with, you know, women and professionalism and what's appropriate, and how the genders engage with each other. You know, it's really interesting to revisit these subjects every like 10 years for me, because the world has changed.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And I think it's Connie, but it could be another Batterson. What was the process used to recover the tiles of the Eastern Building in LA?
So in some cases, that's a great question. In some cases, they just seal and then use special kind of paints to try to match the old tile. In some cases, if they can replicate and produce new tiles, they will. Generally, that only happens when it's closer to the ground, where it's more obvious and you want aesthetics. I think a lot of the upper was really about, dare I say, sealing and doing more faux treatment and not actually creating new tiles and putting them in place. I will mention that the more highly detailed tiles that like Gladding McBean still has most of their molds. So if you had a historic building with an urn or a figure and they still have the mold, they are capable of basically making an original copy for you.
Great. And Karen, you wanted to know, when do they apply the multi-colors? And she remarks that the alignment is amazing among all the tiles.
The colors really came on as we move forward. Really, I think probably driven by designers as much as anything else. Really wanting to expand. That happened both on the what I would call Prismacolors, as well as the stone treatments. Many of you may be familiar with the mosque building, the mosque court and California State Library building. It went through a major renovation 10 years ago, and all of its facings are Gladding McBean terracotta made to look like stone. So, they went to great lengths, regardless of, basically it got to a point, if you wanted to pay for it, they'd give you any color or any kind of stone treatment that you could possibly desire. And generally the architect would call that out. The architect was really the one who was kind of driving that many times.
And Lynn and all of us want to know, where is the Eastern Building in LA? For those of us who would like to visit it.
Oh boy, I lived in LA for 20 years. It is a south. If you know where Pershing Square is, it's about 10 blocks south and maybe a couple blocks east. It's on the south side of town. And one of the things I didn't show that I realize I should have is that on the 11th story before the tower, the developers put in a swimming pool and have the tower lit at night. And it's absolutely the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. If you can imagine being at poolside with this glorious tower, it's very comic book, futuristic, dramatic. And there are celebrities who have or currently own, I believe, I want to say DiCaprio, but I don't think, but there's been some well-known Hollywood types that have had within the tower, each tower floor is a penthouse.
Oh gosh.
Johnny Depp, I think had two. He had two of the tower floors.
And I'm just how many? When was the decline in terracotta? I mean, it's
World War II.
In World War II, and then the add-on to that is why?
A lot of it had to do with style. International style, which really grew out of the minimalism of the German influence of architects. Mies van der Rohe would be an example.
Right.
Walter Gropius, who was one of these famous Bauhaus. He was a president. He was one of the presidents, as was Mies van der Rohe. They both came. Gropius went to Harvard. He was the dean of architecture at Harvard. So, and then there was a whole mid-century modern move. So decorative arts, hanging on decorations, actually just fell by the wayside.
And was there also a movement in Europe at the same time?
Of terracotta?
Terracotta.
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that because I came at this originally from really an Art Deco interest. There's multiple levels of Art Deco, but in 1925, 26, there was a famous exhibition, decoratif, where the word Art Deco comes from, art decoratif, in Paris. And if you see photos from that, it wasn't streamlined modern, it was very much decorative arts. So during that exhibition, they had all of these wonderful buildings that looked like the Maya Hotel from Monrovia, California, I showed you, but more detailed, absolutely fabulous detailed. And African art was an influence, and Asian art was an influence, and highly detailed buildings with lots of decorative arts and decorative terracotta.
Good. And Karen asked it, so I don't have to. I'm going to do, she asked, is Gladding McBean still giving tours or open? I want to add a question to that.
Oh boy, now that is one of the realities is Sacramento was fortunate, and there's a wonderful statewide organization, California Preservation Foundation out of San Francisco. It's the leading, it's where all the professional preservation and restoration architects attend. They generally attract 500 or 600 attendees to this. They do it at a different city in California each year, once a year. And it was going to be in Sacramento in 2020 in May. And one of the things that and I got on the tour, the Gladding McBean has not done their May tours of the factory since roughly 2016, 2017. I was going to get on that tour because that was the last time I heard. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a tour at the factory in 5 or 6 years. And my fear is there may never be one again. And I think part of it is that like Gladding McBean is owned by Pacific Building Products, which is a large corporation. And I think that they're just extremely cautious. You know, we're a litigious society. And I think that they're you know, it's like between, do we want to expose ourselves to having the public in there? And I think they've just decided not to. But
Right.
it's unfortunate because it's a treasure. It is, to me, I think it's one of the great treasures of our area that's not, it's known about, but I think it's even more important than it's ever been talked about.
Right. And it's, if I'm right, it's the oldest, probably almost existing business in the area, 140 years old. Feats of Clay, obviously, they haven't done either. They
Right,
do this
right, which they do a competitive sculpture, pottery sculpture show, and they display them in their kilns, which I also thought we got a kick out of. I thought that was
We were fortunate enough to take that tour about 10, 12 years ago, and it was outstanding.
Yeah,
I agree. I was enthralled. It's one of the reasons, and I think I took the tour maybe 20 years ago, and that's one of the reasons I really inspired me to do that trip, was that, wow, this is a terrific piece of American history.
and you can get Gary Kuritz's book, Kurutz, on Gladding McBean. You've
This
got
is
a
it.
copy of it?
Yes,
Wonderful.
it is
unbelievable
wonderful.
book.
Wonderful. It's wonderful because it has all of these wonderful, one of the great discoveries in the 80s was that Gladding McBean still had all their glass documentation plates, 8x10 glass plates, photographic negative plates from like 1900 to 1940. It was just unbelievable discovery. And Gary was instrumental in getting the entire collection of the California State Library. And really much of this book is based on that collection.
Right. They also have wonderful educational materials for anybody who wants to know more about some of the process. I'm going to go to Gary and then I'll go back to Teresa because he asks, what are the terracotta molds made of? And that's the kind of thing that they have on their website where you can actually download one of their pamphlets. But do you want to answer that? What are the
I believe they're of a plaster. And I do not know the exact formula, but they have to be incredibly durable because they have to keep their detail, you know, through multiple pressings. You know, it's still amazing me to the other thing that astounded me, I talked a little bit about it, is they had to creatively figure out is that once they carved one of these giant gargoyles, let's say the gargoyle is 15 feet high, then they have to back out and say, okay, how are we going to carve up the gargoyle so we can, you know, cast the pieces, because the pieces were generally no more than, let's say, 3 by 4 feet. They have to figure out how to take it apart,
right,
and cast it and then put it back together. So high tolerant too, a very high tolerance.
good. And then we have a question from, oh, she was making a comment. Skinny building in New York City is covered with terracotta in color, and it was built in 2020. I'd love to know, Teresa, if you want to add where that is, because I go to New York often. I would like to, that's one I would like to visit. And
it is on the West 59th Street.
On West 59th.
Yeah.
Gonna have to check that one out for sure.
And but the terracotta tile was made in Germany, specially ordered because this is the house, the high riser for the millionaires. And all the details are very, very rich and very beautifully finished.
Okay.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing. That's wonderful to know.
Good. And I'm just trying to think if, does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask? No, I'm going to do some, I want to thank Bruce again. I'm going to do some, Bruce, thank you so much. I know you're taking off next semester, but I am going to ask you to do me one itsy bitsy favor.
Okay. Okay, well, I'd be happy to.
There are a lot of us that are from Los Angeles, and that's the one thing I wanted to do next semester was to do a panel. I didn't want to do a talk, but I thought it would be wonderful to get 3 or 4 of us from LA and then encourage people who are from LA to share our stories. Would you consider just being part of that panel?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because you're just so knowledgeable about that. I think it would be really wonderful.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, how would you format it? Would it be about the arts? Would it be about just personal life experience? Well, what would be
I think we'll just take a look, arts and culture, what are, the architecture. I think what we would do is we talk about the architecture, probably divide it up into culture and maybe food, where we just have 3 different topics. We each get 5 minutes and then we open it up to people. But we just have so many people from LA. I think it would be wonderful. So many members of Renaissance and the Art Deco Society. I'll put in another plug. If you've been coming to this and you're not a Renaissance member, you can always join. These community programs are free. There's another one tomorrow that I'll be giving on literary hoaxes using the exact same link that you have now. And so we'll use that tomorrow as well. We have another talk on Friday, the 22nd with author Carol Stivers. And so we do have some nighttime programs. So same link. I'll be sending links out to everyone, literally. Karen Yee, who's on this call, is giving a talk, I believe, on November 12th. We have other programs on October 29th. So keep on plugging in these community presentations. And another plug, they are looking for speakers to be able to do programs. Bruce and I are a little tired. It takes a long time. I've probably put 100 hours into it. But if you've traveled, if you've taken a trip, you want to do a talk on anything you're passionate about, I put my email in. Please just send me the thing and I'll make sure that Lorraine Sarn gets it and sends out an application. The deadline for getting stuff into the catalog is the 22nd. Great. So Bruce, is there anything you would like to say in closing? And then we'll stop and we'll go into the green room.
Well, one of the realities of the pandemic is that I like engaging, and I look forward to the opportunity. While this really absolutely allows a great breadth of reaching out across the country, I still enjoy in person if and when that's possible. Yes. So we'll just have to see how that happens. But the other is
take a Cook's tour. Cook's tour is still meeting, Bruce.
But
a walking tour.
The other thing is I'm always encouraging, get out and if you have any curiosities, get out and find them, because it's a wonderful, the rich history our country has. And yeah, it's always enjoyable.
Okay. And Linda, I'm sorry, because I do have one question that I forgot, because Linda actually brings it up. She's saying, thank you for giving her some ideas of places in Ohio. You did mention something, if I missed this, but you said, Zanesville was the center so much in Ohio. Why Ohio? Were there crafts?
Oh, okay. So, I gotta apologize. I didn't have my
presentation.
I didn't.
That was my fault. Yes.
So I will do. So I did briefly mention about commerce and the Atlantic seaboard and Wheeling. Wheeling was on the map like Sacramento because of railroads, and because of river. And in its case, it was the terminus of the Ohio River or at least access the Ohio River, but Wheeling was the terminus of the B&O Railroad. That famous, from children's games, the B&O, Baltimore, Ohio. And so when it opened in the railroad started in the 1830s. I think it finally got to Wheeling in the early 1850s. Then merchants could actually send their goods to Wheeling and then put them on steamboats, and they could ply the Ohio River. And then the opposite, agriculture and pottery, because they're rich. That's the other thing. They're rich clay deposits. So clay was never an issue. And that's actually why Gladding McBean is in Lincoln. There's a clay deposit. You had to have the clay deposit, but then because there was such a rich clay area, then they could send their goods very easily on the railroad to the East Coast. So that's really just like Sacramento.
And Catherine mentioned July is when they do their pottery shows.
Yes.
So I'm up for a road trip next summer.
Terrific event. Terrific event.
So you've been at it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm up for road trips. So Bruce, I want to thank you again. We are going to, if I can do this, I'm having trouble stopping the recording.
Okay. Well, thank everyone.
So there we go. So again, I want to thank Bruce Marwick and all of you from the Sacramento Art Deco Society, Renaissance members, and from Eventbrite to come into another one of our programs, and keep coming.